I would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Gundungurra, Ngunnawal and Nyumpara and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which CSU's campuses are located, and pay respect to their elders, both past and present, and to all Indigenous people joining us today. Now I'd like to hand over to Lindy. I think that you're going to start with the presentation on the evaluation of the OLM. Then I think we'll have Barney coming in for a guest appearance, and then handing over to Sarah to discuss the results, the findings and the implications and so on. So over to you. Thank you, Lindy.
Thanks, Lynn. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. And if anyone would like to ask questions or make comments in the chat throughout the presentation, please do so. But we will hold off until the end of the presentation for discussion, if that's okay.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you.
I don't know how much contact you've had with the online learning model. The faces that I can see, I know are embedded within it and know it deeply, so I don't want to linger long on this. But if you've joined us and you're not familiar with the online learning model and would like a little bit more details, pop it in the chat so that I'm alerted to, Sarah can alert me to anything that needs elaborating. So the focus, the rationale behind the online learning model was to enhance engagement. Sarah and I thought it might be useful to people to get a little bit of an idea of what's our current cohort looks like. So we have 350 online courses, more than any crazy other institution, 25,570 online students. All online courses across the world tend to have a higher attrition. So we're hoping to address that and also assist in the transition to online study, online teaching, and to reduce the sense of isolation that online students and academics tend to feel. The students we currently service tend to be mature age, but 25 to 29 is, I suppose, the most common, the median age, but 30 to 34 is also well represented, to a total of 64% of our students our online students are in that age bracket. 55% of them are in the city. They're domestic students. We're not attracting a lot of internationals. Most of them are working full-time. A lot of them have caring responsibilities for children and elderly parents or elderly people. They tend to be taking one or two subjects, not a whole load, because most of them are part-time. A large number from BJBS, I was fascinated to see that number, 11,000. Well, 11,200, no, 1,100, no. Now I'm confused. It's 11 out of the 25,000, which means the students in BJBS who are involved in TOL, and everyone's experiencing the culture of TOL, everyone in the whole faculty, it's nearly half of our online students who are being impacted by that activity. So it's something to bear in mind as part of the culture into which we're working and the change practices that are already happening. So the level of education of our students, the highest education level tends to be in those online students. Year 10 is the most common, and then TAFE, and then Year 12. So that's a particular characteristic of our cohort that we may not necessarily be aware of. And it's a median SES. I guess that we are more conscious of that possibility. So the model itself, the evaluation is located on the Education Hub up here under Publications. If you click on there, it takes you to the document, the report on the evaluation. And those pictures there are the people who did the evaluation. And this is the project. So these beautiful people down here are the QLT were the main drivers of the workload of the scale up of the model. But initially we had the model developed and trialled in a small number of subjects. I'm not sure. Barney, are you with us yet? Barney was going to speak to this slide, but...
I'm with you.
Ah, good. So I will just hand straight to Barney and he can speak to the process of creating the model in a very hurried...
Now, can you see me? I can see myself, but yep.
You
So
can now.
nodding. Yep, great, thanks. So I guess, you know, the history of the online learning model dates back to the development of the distance education strategy, which was co-authored by Sandra Wills, Don Olcott and myself in about 2014. And so one piece of that strategy was the early version of the online learning model. And the intention was that it would be a model that would kind of articulate the nature of a online learning experience that would increase students' engagement with content, with teachers and with peers. And the intention was that the model would be able to be implemented in different ways in different disciplines to meet the particular needs of different discipline cohorts and different kinds of students. So the model at that stage was then workshopped. We did You Imagine did a conversations about online learning workshop on multiple workshops on multiple campuses. I think there was between 150 and 200 staff attended those. And as part of that workshopping of the model, we used a number of approaches to try and just get people's perspective on its fit for their disciplines. And generally the fit was pretty good. We did then pilot it in 28 subjects across the 4 faculties as they were at that stage, each focusing on one of the 7 elements of the model. And part of that was to do a bit of a reality check on the elements, but also see what kinds of creative strategies could come out as exemplars going forward. Following that pilot and following the workshopping on all of the campuses, we then refined the model to the current version, which is version 2, which is what was used in the phase 1 scale up. I guess the other key drivers, I guess, for coming up with a new model were, quantitative indicators suggesting that CSU was losing market share, perhaps wasn't at the quality level that we were hoping for in terms of particularly student satisfaction, and as Lindy mentioned, attrition. And I guess an overall sense that our approaches to teaching online, which kind of had their genesis in distance education, were a little bit too close to the put it online and wait and see if they've got a question on the discussion forum, which was kind of innovative when we moved from print to online, but was being overtaken by a lot of the new online competitors who were providing a much more comprehensive online learning experience. And so trying to come up with a model that characterised where we were aspiring to be in terms of our online pedagogies was seen as an important step towards the changes we needed. So I hope that's not too long-winded a background.
Great, thank you. So Barney, please feel free to, Barney and Sarah, chip in within any of these following slides, looking at the aim of that project, not the aim of the model, but the project was to enhance staff and student engagement online, to support staff through subject design expertise, to develop high quality learning resources, and to do an in-depth evaluation of the model. And that's the model that we implemented at that point. I think it's worth noting that the development has been iterative, and the names of the elements that we piloted are not the same as the elements that we scaled up, and won't be the same as the version that will inform our future practice, as we're in the process right now in revising some of those names to be closer representation of what works in practice. So we focused on those elements that we just looked at achieve 4 goals. They help build relationships, they help connect the theory to practice, enhancement of technology, and personalising of learning experiences. So there are 7 elements, but those 4 focus goals cover all of them in what we're managing to achieve with them. So in the implementation, there were down to 3 faculties. We did more before, there were 4 faculties. Across the 3 faculties, there were 8 courses for the scale-up. We ended up with dealing with 116 subjects, touching 9,478 students in that process. The QLT were embedded, and the QLT standards were embedded through the process. The 3 quality learning and teaching leads, Carol, Julie and Judy, worked with a team in each of those faculties. We developed the learning exchange with examples of strategies for every one of the elements, several examples, which is still being developed. And there were dedicated education designers working in the space, improving teacher presence, among other things. So there were improved landing pages. The general achievements were restructuring of discussion boards, revised assessment criteria design, improved subject and module organisation, incorporating adaptive release, multiple choice quizzes, Padlets, Flipgrid, Smart Sparrow, other adaptive approaches, recordings, videos and audio to establish that teacher presence on that landing page, faculty templates to get some standardisation of the look and feel, improved lecture and tutorial support materials, podcasts of lectures, uploading presentations, and improved general communication within subjects. So collaboration and reflection through the use of Adobe Connect, Peerwise, Google Forms, and others. The data collection method is, are we handing back to you, Sarah? You're not going to talk about data collection. Okay. So, the evaluation was an iterative process because the project was iterative. So we had the first ethics application for the pilot, and James Purkis was involved in the early evaluation. So we had our ethics, we had surveys and interviews with students and staff, and also did a comparison between, we used some of the national survey data that we also had access to. So one of the challenges throughout the process of evaluating was the question marks across this institution about the ethical implications of researching your own practice. So the first round in the pilot, we were all very actively involved in gathering the data and doing the interviews and running the surveys, writing and running the surveys. But by the time we reached the toll ethics, the Ethics Committee felt that it wasn't appropriate that those people actively involved in the project should also be gathering the data, because there's a question of coercion and there are challenges in being able to demonstrate that the data is not tainted by your involvement in the practice. My personal experience has been that was like being strangled. To be denied access to the interview data when it was live meant I didn't feel I knew, I didn't learn what needed to be immediately reacted to firsthand. I had to take a step away from the project because I wasn't getting that feedback. So that's a conversation I'd like us to have today, if possible. The question about when you're evaluating your own practice and responding to that evaluation immediately, as we have throughout this, it's not strictly an action research project. Maybe it should have been. Maybe we would have been able to get through the ethics more smoothly. I don't know. I'd really like a reaction to this at this point before Barney leaves, so that's why I've lingered over this moment. And from anyone else, if you'd like to have a say on your feelings about the ethical implications of evaluating your own practice in practice and how we might do that effectively without falling foul of the ethics committee's constraints. So Barney, your feelings first up. Unmute.
Look, I don't have a huge amount to say. I feel as though there are very definitely different views around the responsibilities of research ethics committees and where the boundaries around research are. There are people who consider that it's only research if you're generating new knowledge to be published as research, and it's not research if it's evaluation for the purposes of improving practice within the institution. There are people involved in ethics committees who believe that that kind of evaluation focused on practice improvement is still research, and therefore you need ethics approval for virtually any kind of evaluation activity that involves collecting data from people. But it's clear that there's a lot of evaluation of practice that goes on across the university. Your voice surveys, all kinds of things which don't have ethics approval, never have, and there's nobody ever takes anyone to account, calls anyone to account for it. So, I think it's an issue beyond the university. And I know that these debates have happened, in the scholarly community as well, but I just don't think there's a clear answer.
Thanks, Barney. Sarah, can I throw to you now?
Yeah, I was just typing another response, actually. I'll delete that. It's interesting that the ethics committees within universities are theoretically meant to be guided by and operate according to the standards set by the NH and MRC. There's national standards to guide ethics committees in their decision making, and that forms the basis of the application that you complete. Yet each committee is idiosyncratic and deviates from that according to the levels of their own experience and understanding. So even though there is a standardised framework to guide decision making, it comes down to individual membership and their experience with research, and you do get pigeonholed, I believe, in terms of what's evaluation and what's research. And it's a bigger discussion that needs to happen, and maybe there is a few sentences in the standards that demarcates them, but at the end of the day, as long as there is no harm done, that the research or evaluation is conducted in a way that is sensitive and confidentiality is maintained, the individual committees shouldn't be making an overarching decision about yes or no, you can do this because it is or isn't evaluation or research. So I think the lines are very blurred based on experience at individual institutions.
Does anybody else want to comment on that before we move on to look at the evaluation findings?
Can I just say something quickly, Lindy?
Yes, please do.
I think the points that Sarah and Barney make are all very valid, and it has to do with personalities on the ethics committees as well, and their backgrounds and experiences. And maybe they were like holding you true to what you'd put through in the original proposal. And that sometimes can get iffy. So what they want is an amendment of the original proposal so that they can respond to it. But I was just wondering about whether it is actually, and their lack of understanding, not ours. When we say action research, they're expecting they have certain expectations. And, and it's in keeping with the publications element. But I was just wondering, and it is valid to do it this way, you can actually, and it's good practice as well. It's that scholarly practice. If you respond to and make changes as you go, that's referred to as action learning. So I guess there's that other framework that you may want to actually put in as a response to that ethics committee to validate the practice.
And just to be clear, that it wasn't an ongoing, it wasn't a problem throughout the process. It was only a problem initially getting ethics approval to begin. So, and once we had the constraints, we adhered to them. We weren't rebelling against the advice we'd been given, but the advice we were given was so constraining that I felt that it diminished the usefulness of the exercise.
That's so, Lindy, look, some really interesting points have been raised there, and I do think that it would probably be valuable to open this up for further discussion after your presentation, given the experience and background of other people that are in the audience. Some people may have had some other more recent experiences as well, but you've certainly flagged some issues that anyone involved in doing any sort of scholarship in learning and teaching need to be aware of. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Lynn. I realise that Barney has to leave us. That's why I've thrown that in the middle. Over to Sarah now.
Thanks, Lindy. So we did student surveys. We used surveys and interviews, as Lindy mentioned earlier. With the student surveys, we purposefully constructed them to measure students' experience with the OLM elements. So we asked students demographic information, but also a bit about their study preferences. So did they prefer to learn on their own or learn with a group? How flexible would they like their learning to be? So really open-ended questions there. And then we asked them more directly about how important they perceived the individual OLM elements to be to their learning and what was their experience of each element in their subject. We also asked them about overall satisfaction with the experience of their learning, and we used some items from the National Student Experience Survey and also items from our CSU survey, so that would enable us to compare against a bigger data set. So here's an example of one of the questions that students were asked, and we used SurveyMonkey to do this. And then the staff survey. So we did both surveys at the beginning, at the end of 1730 and the end of 1760 as well. And with the staff survey, we did that at the beginning and end of 60, just to capture their experiences. We surveyed all staff that were involved, and there were quite a few items, including the teaching experience that staff had online and face-to-face and at CSU and more broadly. So we really could understand the context of their responses. So we asked them about how familiar and confident they were with the elements and how useful they thought the elements would be for student learning, as well as more practical questions relating to the actual implementation of the OLM and what suggestions they had for improvement moving forward. And that's an example of one of their questions, which is going to relate to a graph I'm going to show you later. Staff were asked how important they thought each of these elements were to student learning, and they were also asked to predict how important they thought students, I think it was, and some really interesting results came out of that, which I'll talk about a bit later. So the interviews were all conducted by phone, and students were asked if they wanted to participate in the interview through subject announcements, but also it was an item in the questionnaire. So students could enter their email address to be contacted about that. We weren't able to individually email students to participate due to privacy regulations within the university. So we had to recruit via subject announcements and repeated subject announcements to get enough responses. So the interviews captured similar information to the survey, but it enabled us to explore their answers in more detail. Now, with the staff, we conducted focus groups with the educational designers, the education support coordinators and media technologists. We also did individual interviews with the QLT leads and project leads, but we didn't do interviews with the individual academic staff members because they said that their responses would not vary much from the survey, and also due to time constraints as well. So the focus groups which were conducted focused on design and implementation, achievements and challenges, and we had quite a number of transcripts imported into NVivo for analysis. So the key findings, we had a 13% response rate, and although there were 1,270 individual student survey responses, because students were responding about more than one subject, we got up to, I think it was around 1,700 responses to individual OLM elements. So the survey students completed all the questions, and the last question was, did you complete another subject in this list? And if they did, then they were asked the same questions again, which they did. So they were really, those who responded, I think, really wanted their feedback to be heard. We had 34 staff surveys returned from across all different categories of staff, and there were 19 individual student interviews conducted. And the key theme coming out of all of the data really is the importance of teacher presence and how impactful that is. When it occurs, students really noted it, and particularly noted how accessible their teacher was and how approachable they were. They were the two words that kept popping up over and over again. But also there were quite a number of subjects, unfortunately, where students commented on the absence of teacher access or teachers not answering questions on the discussion forum. That was really noticeable to them, and it had a direct impact on their motivation for the subject and their sense of belonging, especially if they're only doing one or two subjects a semester and they have a teacher who, for whatever reasons, and there are many reasons, for whatever reason isn't accessible or isn't responsive, and that's their only experience with the subject for 6 months. They have a subject for 6 months and then they have everything else going on in their life. If there's no interaction going on with their teacher, then their sense of belonging really drops. And motivation really drops. So overall, some of the really key findings was that there was a really high sense of agreement by the students that all of the elements in the OLM are important to their learning. The teacher presence is most important, and they all wanted, or pretty much 98% wanted, all of their lecture and workshops recorded. So even though as teachers you might notice a lack of attendance at your sessions, students are watching those recordings. And it is really hard when you're giving a presentation or running an OLM and there's a lack of interaction, or you're trying to gauge student understanding in real time. I think it's important for teachers to know, though, that those recordings are watched and they do contribute to student learning. So overall, we did a regression analysis of each of the OLM elements, and we correlated that with student satisfaction. And we found that perceptions of experiencing the OLM and the elements predicted about 71% of student satisfaction, which is pretty strong finding, and gives us some evidence that staff are wanting that they should be paying some serious attention to the OLM and how you can incorporate these elements in your subject. So this graph shows the difference between students' perceptions of importance of the elements and their perceptions of the experience of those elements. And the importance, follows a similar trend to their experience, but you can see there's quite a difference in the interaction with the professions element, where 90%, almost 90% of students say that it's important for their learning, but only 50% experience that. And that's concerning when the subjects involved included nursing and social work, subjects with big elements of professional practice, but it may be that the subjects which were included were early on in the course and they hadn't experienced that yet, but they do see it as very important to their learning, and we need to strive to incorporate more interaction with the professions through, for example, YouTube clips or interviews with people in the profession, through using some media stories, for example, getting guest speakers to come in. There's a whole host of strategies which you can find on the Learning Exchange. And there are more and more exemplars being created to help with this. So other key findings, there was mixed opinion about working with others. Some students, of course, liked it, some hated it. It really depends on the purpose of the task and how much assessment was tied to that task and what tools were available to scaffold that. So also staff found it difficult to facilitate the learning in learning communities and learning in groups. So that's another area as an institution that we might want to look at, how we can support staff to do that well. Assessment was one of the main themes, which also came out of the interview, when there was a lack of clarity, when they couldn't see the point of a task, when they felt exams, there was too much weighting on the exams. That was a pretty common response. And just really inauthentic tasks such as memorising essays, to go into an exam and regurgitate an essay in, I won't say the subject, but it was a practice-based subject, skills-based subject. And so it was really obvious to students that they were being examined on something that wasn't a reflection of the skills that they needed. So students are really mindful of that, and they're savvy, I think, about how they should be assessed. So staff opinion. Ellen, yes, I can send you a copy of those slides. Or Lynn, should I send it to you? Yeah. So Lynn will distribute the slides afterwards. So staff did report a lack of confidence to implement some of the elements, in particular e-assessment, which is still relatively new. And I think maybe we're still finding our way with the use of different tools. So Interact has some limited ability. Staff find the tools difficult to use to implement e-assessment, but it's an area that we need to work on more. Time and motivation were the main limitations, as you might expect, for staff engagement with OLM and for upskilling. Overall, staff felt that more time was needed and more planning was needed to implement the OLM. But as I'll show you in the next slide or two, staff did tend to underestimate the importance of the OLM to student learning. And I think now, as this evidence is coming out, it would be really interesting to do some follow-up work, maybe 6 or 12 months down the track, to see how the OLM is being implemented and what impact it is having. The staff want to see the evidence of this. So this is a very busy slide. So if we start with the bars, I wanted to include everything on there though, because I think it tells an interesting story. So what we see is the student perceptions of the inclusion of these elements in their subject. So you've seen this slide before, the bars are just a bit different. What I want to draw your attention to though is the mapping of staff perceptions of the importance to students, which is the orange line, and then staff's actual perception of that importance. The staff have quite a different viewpoint. For example, with the learning community element, 40% of staff thought it would be important to students, but in contrast, they thought 70% of staff agreed that it was important. So they're underestimating students' sense of importance of that. But you can see when you look at the blue line, which is pretty much the middle line throughout, there is an alignment between staff perception of importance and their actual extent to which they included it in their subjects. So there's an alignment there, except for interactions with the profession, which is why I've circled it, that staff thought it was important and students thought it was important, but it wasn't really well implemented. So that's why we've identified that as an area to focus staff professional development on. The other area I've highlighted is you can see how well aligned in terms of learning resources, that staff and student perceptions are on par, but again there's a bit of a gap between the sense of importance and students' perceptions of experiencing high quality learning resources. So maybe that's worth tapping into some more. What do students consider a high quality learning resource to be? And I have to admit in the interviews that question always required clarification, and I had to provide some examples to students. So this could be a fault in the survey methodology, that we need to be clearer with our questions. And you can see there's quite a discrepancy as well in the last column. The range of e-assessments is there's quite a spread between student perceptions of importance. 90% of students thought e-assessment was important, but staff, less than 20% of staff thought that students thought it was important.
Would anyone like to comment on that slide?
Hi, it's Ruhina. How are you?
Hi, Ruhina.
I just wanted to ask a quick question regarding that perception of high quality learning resources. You're right, it's not very clear. So when you did the interview, do you have any example of what the student thought high quality?
So I put it to them that it included things like that were interactive resources or quizzes or high quality images, for example.
Okay, so quizzes, interactive resources, okay, and all right. Because I was just trying to think about, because I always find this is somewhere, there is a gap between what I think the students need, and that's enough for them,
Yes.
and what the students perceive they might like something completely different.
Yes, and it's the range as well. So if you have text, PowerPoints, YouTube clips, but it's a really fine line that students also don't want there to be too many resources, and they complained when subjects had...
Yes, happened to me. That's the reason. Yeah, I had this as well. Students are saying, you want me to do too much. So yeah. That's the reason trying to do the balance is, okay. Yeah. So thanks for that. I just wanted some example on that one.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for clarifying, Rahina.
Any other comments?
Ellen has just asked how current the resources are. Yeah, good point. I don't think I explicitly said that in my prompting questions to the students, but they didn't mention that either. But yeah, that would certainly be a factor in the quality of the learning resources. Perhaps we need to draw up some minimum standards for that. So that's something that's ongoing. There is ongoing refinement of the OLM. So we'll take all of that on board.
Sarah, would you like to comment on the learning communities data there, that gap?
So some of the staff did conflate learning community with group work. And so that has also skewed the results a little bit. The learning community is really defined as a student's sense of belonging to a particular cohort, for example, or having a sense of belonging to the subject and coming together with others to learn. And students, that actually came out through Facebook groups. Quite a few students said that they got that sense of belonging from Facebook groups for subjects, which were really common. And that was a surprising finding. And even after students had finished a subject, they remained on that Facebook group, and it became a support for other students coming in to say, should I really spend this much money on the textbook? Is it worth my while? Or where's the best resource for this? Or where should I do my placement? Or who did you have when you did this subject? Are they a good teacher? There's all sorts of questions they ask each other on these Facebook groups. And I would say they're in, more than half of the subjects have a Facebook group going on with a lot of interaction.
Mm.
And that's also come out in the toll student interviews I've done as well. So students aren't getting that through Interact or through any other mechanism that CSU is providing, and they're finding that they get what they want out of the Facebook groups.
Mm.
So some insights overall. When I started looking into the national measures of student engagement, such as the Quilt website, which hosts all of the results, you can go in there and look at results for your institution compared with others. I found that there weren't any, you couldn't filter down to online only subjects. And recently they've added a little footnote to one of their reports to say that they're actually changing some of their questions, and that some of their questions are clearly not appropriate for online cohorts. So they're addressing this as well. And I haven't included any of those slides about teacher quality and student sense of belonging for those reasons. They're in the report, but they don't really allow you to filter down to online only students. Now, the student self-reported experience, there was some thought that we could use this as a proxy measure of how engaged students are in the subject. That requires some more thought and maybe some triangulation with the lean analytics data. Excuse me. But as I mentioned before, this is after we did do some pilots, and this quite large data set is based on one iteration, and it would be really useful to do some follow-up evaluations just to see if these trends persist, and as staff get more familiar and confident, it would be interesting to see how some of the student responses to those questions change. Also, if students get used to the language used in the surveys some more as well. So we don't want to change the surveys too much that we can't compare them down the track with future iterations, but we do need to be mindful of how the questions are being interpreted and have some clear understanding of what the specific terms mean, such as with the learning resources, for example.